the subscribe button, especially the bell on the right side. Otherwise, you will miss the latest videos.
Good day, Nick. How was your New Year?
I'm good.
Last session, you really took us around a fascinating journey. You took us through the Synodic cycle of Venus, which I call as the dance of Venus. It was rhythmic, it was beautiful, it was symmetrical, and it was very, very regular. But what we really want to know is how it really impacts the natives. Does it impact everyone in the country, or does it impact certain combinations only?
I think it only impacts certain people.
Okay.
And there are some ways to use a horoscope to determine whether or not that's the case. And I'll be touching on some of that here and there. Although I wouldn't say I have a 100% clear picture of why that is. I'll find some good sort of theories, and then I'll find some examples that destroy the theory, at least call it into question. And that's my practice, to always, not just sort of rely on a conclusion I've come to, but to keep testing whatever conclusion I come to. So it's reasonably clear. Certainly with most of the examples, it'll be fairly clear-cut as to why the person I'm discussing does have a life that's very much timed according to the cycle of Venus. In this case, just the Venus retrogrades I'm looking at, not the entire synodic cycle for these examples, because they really stand out. And also because everyone I'm about to talk to is a world leader, is someone who's had tremendous political impact on the planet. Mind you, I do want to emphasize that this is not a technique that only works with famous, powerful people. I've been using this method, this knowledge with private clients for quite a few years now, about 15 years, and there most definitely are, the planet is full of ordinary human beings, as it were, whose lives also seem to be timed according to this cycle. What I can say in addition, it's not something we'll be covering today, but some people who aren't Venus people, so to speak, are Mars people. I can take other people's lives and use the same method I'm about to show you with the examples with Venus retrogrades, only using Mars retrogrades or the general Mars synodic cycle. So this is a sort of a look at every planet individually. The thing about Venus and Mars is because of the fact that the retrogrades are fairly rare. Like if we're talking about Jupiter or Saturn retrogrades, that's 1/3 of time. 1/3 of the people on the planet have those planets retrograde, which is interesting, but you can never really get anything sort of statistically solid out of a ratio like that. Similarly, Mercury retrogrades are quite frequent, and there's enough of us with those. But with Venus and Mars, you're really getting down to about 1/5 or 1/6 or 1/7 of total time, and all the people whose birth charts have it, and so on and so forth. So one can really, and then what I'm about to do with Venus now is really looking at just one Venus retrograde, one of the 5 at a time, which is really about 5% of total time. It's a very small fraction. And when you see the examples I'm going to show you, you can see how this work using these 2 planets, or at least using Venus today, how striking it is. How it's what makes the examples work is the fact that the retrogrades just aren't as frequent as some of those other planets.
They're very excited.
Yeah, all right, good. Are we ready to start? We have any other quick little things I should clarify? Okay.
Well, as you show us the case studies, if there are any questions that pop up in my mind, I'll surely ask them.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm about to share my screen, and then I'll go to there. Okay, I'm sharing my screen, and I will start the presentation. So, anyone who sat through, where's the play? There it is. Anyone who sat through part 1, I've already taken you through the 5 Venus retrogrades and where they occur. So I'm going to start with red 1. I'm going to talk about a few people whose lives were timed by red 1. You don't need to be a great historical expert to know everyone I'm about to discuss is quite well known to anyone on the planet, really.
Okay.
So here we go, red one. These days, we just had a red one retrograde earlier in 2017. It went from 13 tropical Aries to 26 tropical Pisces.
Mm-hmm.
If we go back, way back in time to 1889, this retrograde used to go from 19 tropical Taurus to 2 tropical Taurus. And there's, now here's Joseph Stalin. He was not born during a red one. He was actually born during a blue 2.
Okay.
But we can see, we can see a blue 2, meaning he's got the Sun and Venus very close to conjunct in tropical Sagittarius. But there are many events in his life that we can time according to the red 1 period. For instance, the Russian Revolution, which started in 1905, not the eventual 1917 Bolshevik triumph, but the 1905 revolution, there were a few key events. These aren't personal to him, but it just sort of sets us up for where we're going with his life. Because obviously he would eventually be the leader of the Soviet Union, so anything to do with the Bolshevik Party or the revolution is relevant to his life, whether it's a personal detail or just a general political one. So number one, the actual Bolshevik Party, which broke away from the larger sort of communist revolutionary group, the other group being the Mensheviks, they had their own personal congress during the Red One period as the revolution was breaking out in 1905. Secondly, another important detail was at the time of this first revolution, Russia was at war at Japan, and Japan, this is one of the most famous naval battles in all military history, when the Japanese Navy sank almost the entire Russian fleet in one day. This was also during the Red One. And finally, another famous event was the Russian Navy's mutiny on the Battleship Potemkin. There's a very famous movie that was made about this in the Soviet Union. This also took place during the Red One. And these are all the things that are big, momentous events that trigger the beginning of the Russian Revolution, what will lead to their eventual triumph 12 years later. Now, if we jump ahead to 8 years later, now we're getting something a little more personal. Joseph Stalin is a revolutionary, and he's already been arrested a few times and sent off to Siberia. But on this day, in March 8th, 1913, he's arrested. He's at a fundraiser dinner, and he's actually trying to escape from the police, and he's dressed as a woman. But they catch him anyway. It must be the big mustache doesn't really work with the woman's dress. And he's sent to Siberia for a long time. In fact, he's in Siberia all through most of the First World War until 1917, as the revolution breaks out. He escapes from Siberia, makes his way to St. Petersburg, and takes part in the Bolshevik takeover in 1917. But it's when he's arrested on this time, you know, he's betrayed by one of the Bolsheviks, and it's what starts to make him very suspicious of traitors and spies everywhere, which, if you know your Soviet history, is going to be very important later on. When we jump ahead 8 years later, not only did the Russian Revolution begin during a Red One, but during a Red One is when it really came to its ultimate climax, when the Bolsheviks defeat the Navy rebels who actually helped them get started with their revolution. This is during a Red One, and it's also when the Soviet Union ended their civil war and ended, you know, they signed treaties with Poland and with Turkey and basically sort of straightened out all the military stuff. So in 1905, during the Red One, the revolution began. In 1921, the revolution ended during the Red One. And Stalin himself was sort of arrested. His central role in between those events is also during the Red One. When we jump ahead, another thing that happened during this Red One in 1921, Stalin's son was born during a Red One. Actually, it's very common for Russian leaders to have a child born during Red One. Vladimir Putin has a daughter born in 1985 during the Red One. And Mikhail Khrushchev had a daughter born during a Red One. And even Tsar Nicholas II, who was overthrown in the Russian Revolution, he had a daughter born during a Red One. There's many, many Russian leaders who have Red One, and even Catherine the Great was born during a Red One. So Red One is a theme that runs in a lot of Russian history. But anyway, Stalin's son, one of his kids, his other daughter was born during a Red 4. So there's a lot of red, obviously, in Stalin's life. And you're going to see, this isn't the only person whose child or weddings and things like that I'm going to bring up that occurred during red periods.
Right.
Now jumping ahead to 1929, another 8 years. First of all, Stalin gets rid of his major adversary, Leon Trotsky. He's banished to Constantinople. He's exiled. Eventually, he'll be murdered during a Red 3 period in 1940. So this is a Red 1 period. Something else, I don't have a slide for it, but something else that begins here in 1929 is Stalin unveils what he calls the 5-year plan. This is the plan for the Soviet Union to industrialize within 5 years. And it's basically an event that it's very successful in some senses, but at the expense of many, many lives. Many people die of famine or from harsh working conditions and what have you. So it's a mixed bag, but in terms of his objective, it's actually very successful. Jumping ahead another 8 years, this is another, remember, Stalin is very paranoid, and he has all his major military leaders arrested and eventually executed, including this guy, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who's a big Soviet war hero. He has them all executed on trumped-up charges, these show trials he has, and trumped-up charges of espionage or betrayal and all this. And this is kind of going to be a problem because in a few years he's going to be at war with Germany, and he's gone and killed all his generals, which makes it a bit difficult to win military battles. But it's obviously an important, he had many of his enemies killed, obviously, and not all of them during Red 1, but the ones who really have the most potential to do harm is during the Red 1. Now, 8 years later, I think this isn't a mystery to anyone, 8 years later, during the Red 1 is when the Soviet Union and the USA enter Germany at the end of the Second World War, or at least at the end of the European part of the Second World War. The war with Japan will go on a bit longer. And this is when the German Nazis surrender. Soviet Union is occupying Berlin. American troops are occupying other parts of Germany, and that's it. The Germans surrender also during a Red 1. Very pronounced. You can see Stalin's sort of triumphs over enemies, if you will, at least up until this point during a Red 1. Although 8 years later, what happens to him? Well, he dies during the Red 1. Stalin, and you're going to see actually a lot of people, I'm going to be coming up with quite a few deaths. Of course, Roosevelt, I was going to talk about Roosevelt, but I decided we don't have time. But Roosevelt died during a Red 1. Mussolini died during a Red 1. We're going to get to Hitler in a minute, and he died during a Red 1. But, you know, it gets even further than that because Stalin's mother died during a Red 1. Mussolini's mother died during a Red 1. Winston Churchill's mother died during a Red 1. So that's a really... That's a lot of, it's obviously a very personal sort of situation to have one's mother pass away, whether the relationship is good or not. In most of these cases it was, except for Stalin here. So that's another sort of just a striking detail that I throw out there is all these guys' mothers. And these are the most powerful men in the world in their time.
During their time, yeah.
So that's enough with Stalin. We're done with him. The next Red 1 guy, as I mentioned, is going to be Adolf Hitler. He's born during the Red 1 period. So that's not ambiguous in itself. Number 2, when he moved from Austria to Germany, it was a Red 1 period. This is obviously important because someday he's going to be the political leader of Germany, but he's an Austrian guy. So this is an unambiguous change in his life. It's a year before the war breaks out. He fights in the German army instead of the Austrian army during the war. That's why 8 years later, in 1921, he's already a member of the Nazi Party. But it's in this period, in the Red 1 period in 1929, that he's, just as it's about to begin, is when he gives his first big speech. He's been giving bigger and bigger speeches, but usually to a few hundred people. But in this day in 1921, he gives a speech in a sort of big arena in Munich, what's going to be a lot more common in the Nazi days. And shortly after that, also in 1921, he resigns from the party because he wants sort of more control, and the party gives in and gives him all this. And this is when they start calling him the Führer and all this. So the bookend before and after the Red 1 period is him really exploding in popularity and taking total control of the National Socialist Party that's going to be known as the Nazi Party. Jumping ahead, this is in 1937. Another thing, I don't have a slide for it today, but another thing that happened in 1937 was the Spanish Civil War was going on, and the Germans bombed Guernica, that famous painting by Pablo Picasso. But the other thing was the pride of Germany at the time, the airships, the Hindenburg airship crashed. This is a famous thing in the there's the newsreel footage that we can see in history movies and what have you, the crash. And this is a tremendous blow to German pride. And then, of course, the other thing is 8 years later, as I've already mentioned, the war is ending and Hitler and his wife commit suicide, just as the Soviet Union is entering Berlin. And of course, as I mentioned, Germany surrenders. So there again, we see this is a very unambiguous, simple theme, not very complicated. You don't need to know a lot of history to appreciate. You don't need to be pro or anti-Hitler to appreciate why these events are really important turning points in his life and how they all seem to turn during the Red I phase. Okay, now moving on to Red II. Got a couple of people here. This is more World War II stuff that I'm getting on about. Okay, now this guy I know he's not terribly popular in India with good reason, but he's also very popular in Britain. But everything I'm going to be talking about with regard to him, regardless of whether one is a fan or not a fan of this man, again, I think this chronology is quite unambiguous in terms of how it shows timing of events in his life. Now, Winston Churchill was born during a Red II, but it's actually the Red III transit that has a more sort of pronounced effect on the timeline of events in his life. First of all, in 1900, his mother, who's a widow, marries a much younger man. In fact, a man who's born 2 weeks before Winston Churchill. So this man, George Cornwall-West and Winston Churchill both have the natal Red II phase. But she gets married during a Red III phase. And it's also right at this time, this same week, that Winston Churchill is going to run for the second time for Parliament. And he has a big rally in Oldham, the town that he's going to be, representing. The thing is, 6 months earlier, he was in South Africa as a reporter during the Boer War, and he was taken prisoner. It's this great epic story. I won't get too tied down in it. Anyone who's read a little bit about him knows about it. He was taken prisoner. He escaped from prison. He managed to escape from South Africa, and he became a worldwide famous figure. He's a 25-year-old man. Even if he had never gone on to become Prime Minister of Britain, this event alone would have put him in the history books. He's already a popular author. His father had been a famous British politician. So now he's gone from being an anonymous, anonymous figure to suddenly running in the election. And just as the Red III period is ending, the polls open for the election that's going to elect him to his first seat in Parliament. And we'll see why this is important in a few ways. Jumping ahead 8 years, he gets married during the Red III, the wife for the rest of his life, Clementine. He marries her during Red III. So not only did his mother remarry in a Red III, he gets married in a Red III. So that's obviously very clear and unambiguous. Remember, Hitler got married during a Red I. And Stalin, I didn't mention it, but he was married during a Red V. So there's a lot of marriages during these Red phases. In 1916, there's a couple of things that happen. Number one, Churchill's sort of biggest adversary is Lord Kitchener, who's one of the major military heads, and he's been very critical of Churchill. But he suddenly is killed when a landmine hits the ship he's in, and he drowns. But in that same time, Churchill has been going through a period of disgrace. There had been, in 1915, there was an attack in the Dardanelles in Turkey that was blamed on him because he was the head of the British Navy, and he resigned from the government and he went and fought in the trenches in the first months of 1916. Really quite astounding. He's 40 years old, or 41, and he's going off and fighting with all the young soldiers in Europe. And he does that for a few months, but then just as we get into the Red III phase, he comes back to Britain, gets a seat in Parliament, takes his seat back in Parliament, and goes through a sort of a commission to clear his name in the Dardanelles affair, and which actually winds up being successful, although he's always tainted in the history books for being blamed with the Dardanelles. So it's a tremendous sort of turnaround for him, where this won't be the first time this happens to him. In fact, we're going to see it happen again. The Red III period for Winston Churchill, along with his the basic timeline of his political career, seems to be times when he comes out of nowhere and really sort of succeeds, which is what happens here, just like it's what happened in 1900 when he first campaigned for his seat in Parliament. Now here we go, 1940. Once again, Churchill has been they call it his wilderness years, the years leading up to 1940 when the Second World War finally begins, because he's always been the guy saying we must be guarding against Hitler and Germany and what they're doing. The rest of the British government is trying more to sort of appease Hitler. So Churchill is named prime minister. He becomes prime minister, and this is going to be sort of the most important 5 years, not just in his life, but really in the history of Great Britain. And I think a lot of people in England would have to agree. So here we are. We're in a Red 3 period, and he becomes prime minister, and he's going to give his most famous speeches, blood, tears, and toil, blood, sweat, tears, and toil, something like that, to that effect, and a lot of the other sort of critical events, and even the famous Battle of London, the really intense bombing of London begins during this Red 3 phase as well in 1940. 8 years later, the war is over, but Churchill is still, he's not even prime minister anymore, but during the next Red 3 phase, he speaks at the Congress of Europe in Den Haag and strongly it emphasizes the need for the United Nations to exist. Just like in the First World War, they had tried the League of Nations, it hadn't really worked, and now he gives this big speech about how they must have a United Nations, so he's very much in favor of that. And then 16 years after that, in 1964, this is a few months, Churchill doesn't die during a Red 3 phase. Unlike all his other guys, we're going to see Charles de Gaulle in a second too, and like all these other World War II guys, they almost all died during Red phases, except Winston. But 6 months before he dies, he spends his last day at British Parliament. He, even long after he was Prime Minister, he remained in Parliament. And remember, he first started running for his first successful seat in Parliament during the Red 3. He became Prime Minister during the Red 3, and now he spends his last day in Parliament in a Red 3. So again, it's very unambiguous the way this cycle just sort of times very naturally events in his life. Okay, now let's move on to the next guy, Charles de Gaulle. As I said, just like with he's 16 years younger than Churchill. But he's also born during a Red 2 like Churchill. And like Churchill, even though he's born during a Red 2, it's the Red 3 period that really seems to dominate events in his life. There are a lot of things in French history in his lifetime that occurred during the Red 2, but I'm not including them for now. There are things like in 1946, the Third French Republic is created during the Red 2 in 1946. The war with Algeria begins during the Red 2 in 1954. And in 1962, he wins a referendum to give his presidency a lot more power during a Red 2. And in fact, he dies during a Red 2 in 1970. So, you know, Hitler was born during a Red 1 and died during a Red 1. De Gaulle is born during a Red 2 and dies during a Red 2 in 1970. So there are some very interesting basic things there, but I'm not even going to touch on those in the slideshow because I'm already giving them a lot of attention here with the Red 3. First of all, his wife, Yvonne de Gaulle, was born during a Red 3. That's relatively unambiguous. They got married during a Red 1 period in 1921. Their daughter, they have an older son, but their daughter, they had two daughters. One died very young. She had health troubles, but the daughter who lived, the middle child and the second child, Elizabeth, she's born during a Red 3. So the mother's born during a Red 3, daughter's born during a Red 3. His father dies during a Red 3. Remember, I've been talking about a lot of parents dying. This is obviously important in an unambiguous way. 8 years after that, well, I've already said Churchill became prime minister in 1940. And if you know your history, it's right. Churchill becomes prime minister as the Germans are invading the Netherlands and Belgium and France. And so France is suddenly occupied by the Nazis. And this is when Charles de Gaulle escapes to England, and he gives this famous radio speech on the BBC to his Frenchmen saying, we're going to fight and all this stuff. So him and Churchill, both in this Red 3 in 1940, are suddenly becoming, out of nowhere, they represent single-handedly at this point the entire resistance movement to the German invasion and everything that's going on. So there's that, but as if his life wasn't complicated enough, his mother also dies during this Red 3, not long after this happens. And in fact, his mother, I'm not showing the chart now, his mother was born in 1860, about 10 days before a Red 3 period began. I have a couple of examples like this where people, I don't know if you have anything like secondary progressions in Vedic astrology, or if your viewers are going to know what that means. It's when you assign for every day following the date of birth equals a year in the person's life. Okay, so you know about that. So in other words, even though she wasn't born during a red 3, by the time she was about 10 years old, her progress chart would be in a red 3. And I do have a couple of examples like that. And when we're talking about why does someone's life sort of connect with these cycles, this might be one of the examples. I've got a very good Indian example coming up later, someone with a similar situation as this. But anyway, again, this isn't ambiguous. De Gaulle's mother and father died during this. His wife was born during it. His daughter was born during it. He's become the leader of the Free French during this. So these are tremendous and unambiguous events in his chronology. And one last thing, the last red 3 of his period, he's president of France. The Americans haven't quite gone full into war with Vietnam. They have advisors there, but de Gaulle, of course, France used to be in a war with the Vietnamese, the first part of their independence war in Vietnam. And so now he's speaking out against U.S. policy, and he's the most vocal critic of U.S. policy, even before any of the real U.S. military shenanigans, if you will, in Vietnam have begun. So it's a sort of important point for him as a spokesman for there. So that's red 3. Again, I think it's a relatively, like the other chronologies I've shown so far, relatively unambiguous outline of how these cycles operated in their lives. I think, is that all? I think I've done all my World War II guys.
I'll ask a few questions.
Yes, please do, before I continue. Yeah, I know I'm sort of racing through them. Maybe it's good to just sort of pause and consider what maybe isn't clear so far.
No, it's good that, people after seeing this video will definitely go back to history and then check out all the details and get far more information than what you have just suggested. But what I wanted to say is, could there be a correlation between the country and the key people, the generals or the presidents or whatsoever, because they just happen to be agents of the destiny of the country? So is it fair to say that when you get a forthcoming red 2 or red 3, there could be some instances or some events in the life of the country?
Yeah, very much. Certainly, when I was showing Stalin, there's a lot of red 1 in Russian history. I've barely scratched the surface. In fact, I gave the Stalin example because otherwise it would involve taking you through 2 hours of Russian history. It's very fascinating. Through the royal family, through the Soviet period, through the modern era with Putin. I will be touching on Putin a little bit later in this conversation. But I mean, it's so much, it's so dense, it's not appropriate for a video, but absolutely. Same thing with German history. I can take you back to the era before Hitler, when Kaiser Wilhelm was born during the Red 2, and many key events occurred during his reign during Red 1 periods, and the birth of important people in his regime in Red 1 periods. So certainly Russia, Germany, the Red 1 seems powerful. I illustrated how Charles de Gaulle, the Red 2, is very powerful for France. In a few minutes, I'll be showing you how Red 4 is very central to at least modern Indian history. The beautiful thing about Indian history is it's so vast and so long, and I'm mostly a modern historian. I am reading a lot of books about ancient and older Indian history, but for the time being, I'm more modern. I'm covering modern Indian history, but I'm going to come to your question again. We're going to see again how the Venus cycle in the life of a central political figure for a nation interweaves itself into the actual political history of that nation. So yeah, to answer your question again and again, I would say absolutely. In many ways, I'm just sort of illustrating these biographies to give you the neatest, tiniest little sketch of how these things play out. But with everything I'm discussing, we can always go much, much deeper into the topic. And there is more, I know already because I've done a lot of the work, but if your viewers also just on their own accord, take note of these cycles and go and do their own historical work, they'll stumble across the same amazing facts that I have. So that's really central there. Yeah.
The second question that I have is, assuming that a person is born in a red 1 or a red 2, but a couple of major events happen in a different red, let's say a red 3 or red 4, would it be fair to assume that many of their futuristic turning points or major events will happen in the same cycles?
Typically, it's a very reliable thing, you know. If you see it sort of popping up, like someone who, like everyone I've been talking about so far is dead, and with the exception of Vladimir Putin, I'm only talking about dead people. So it's much easier, and they're people who lived fairly long lives,
Yes.
so we can go through their timeline and find all these events, and it sort of speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And I'm not taking you into all the fine points of horoscopic astrology in either system. I'm just talking about something very simple that exists outside our systems, but I think informs them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think absolutely there's in every case, if you look deep at the natal horoscope and the transits, you can see that there is a sort of correlation. And then when I'm reading for clients, and things come up in conversation, and it turns out, you know, someone's children are born during a red 2, and then it turns out, oh, also their spouse is born during a red 2, and I know the marriage is rocky, and a red 2 is coming up, and I think, well, you know, this is a real hot spot in time, and
Yes.
and the two of you need to sort of make it through this red 2 and every red 2 because it tends to be a point upon which this person's life switches. That's just sort of one example off the top of my head. I've had many conversations with people where we can anticipate where things are going very much just based on this technique. If not always the what exactly it's going to be, the when, you know, more than anything, because of course it really, you want to go back to your system, be it a Vedic system or a Western system, to fine tune everything to what exactly is going to happen, or what do I think is going to happen. But just in terms of finding that point in time where, you know, it's a hot spot, it's a period in time where things always sort of change in a really pronounced way. One can be quite sure that's going to be on the nose. It's going to be relevant in the person's life as they continue.
Yeah. And stretching it a bit further, if supposing there is a presidential race and you have 3 candidates, and you just analyze their horoscopes in the past, and you see only one of them is having a lot of events in the red phases, is it likely that he's going to win more than the others? I'm sorry, I didn't catch. Is it likely that he's going to win more than the others if the country is having events predominantly in the red phases?
For the most part, yeah, although I can think of some examples. I'm about to go to an American president now, and red 3 is a big thing in American history. But I also know off the top of my head that the red 3 guys don't always win, but they don't win the presidency, but they can have very, very important
major roles to play. Okay.
Yeah, so it's a good bet, but it's not definitive. I can think at least, and certainly that question's very well timed, because I'm about to go to a U.S. president whose life is very much tied to red 3 transits. But I know other people who were red 3s who wanted to be president and couldn't get there, even though they tried very hard. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anyone who tried harder than Nelson Rockefeller, who was born during a red 3, and you can see transits in his life are very important during red 3. He's a Rockefeller, so he's very wealthy, obviously, but no matter how he tried, he was governor of New York, he tried and tried and tried to be a president, couldn't do it. And then when the person I'm about to speak about, I'll just go to his slide now, it's Richard Nixon. When Richard Nixon had to resign, his vice president, Gerald Ford, became president, and Nelson Rockefeller was basically brought on to be his vice president, but he had to, in order to become vice president, he wanted it so badly, just for the chance that he might be president, that he had to disclose all his financial details, and all the other Rockefeller family were really upset with him about that. So we see, and that's just one example off the top of my head. I can think of a lot of red 3 presidents or U.S. political figures who didn't quite win, as you said. But it is definitely something I would look at. Now, Richard Nixon wasn't born during the red period. He's born during the black 3 period. Although when he was about 30 years old, again, by secondary progression, he would have moved into a red 1. So that by the time he was beginning his political career and to the end of his life, he would have been in a progressed red 1 phase. His natal Venus is in tropical Pisces, but I'm going to show you again, he's someone for whom the red 3 transit really is a very pronounced one. Number one, here we go again, marriage. I keep coming back to it. Remember Churchill's marriage and de Gaulle's marriage and all these. Richard Nixon married his wife during a Red 3 period in 1940. 8 years later, he's now a congressman, and he first a couple of things happened during the Red 3 phase in 1948 that are important to his political career. Number one, this was a bill that he did with actually the Karl Mundt, the man with whom he drafted this very important bill, which restricted the activities of communists. Karl Mundt was born during a Red 3. So he teams up with someone born during the Red 3, and during the Red 3 passes this major piece of legislation. He's still in his first term as a congressman, so he's not very well known, and it helps bring him up to prominence. Number two, during 1948, his second daughter is born. So yet again, we see a child being born during a popular phase. His daughter, Julie, who wound up marrying the grandson of President Eisenhower. Nixon would soon serve as the vice president to President Eisenhower. And then the other thing in 1948 is this is another important sort of period in Nixon's life, again having to do with communists. This guy, Whittaker Chambers, gives testimony before the House of Un-American Activities Commission, which is all about the sort of what they call the communist witch hunts now. And Nixon was very active as a young congressman with this. And this testimony would spur a whole case. I won't get into it, but an espionage case that, again, is going to put Nixon, who's just still an unknown congressman, is going to put him in the newsreels and really make him famous, which is going to lead to him becoming a senator in 1950 and then becoming vice president in 1952. So it's a very quick political ascent, but it has a lot to do with what he's doing with regard to fighting communism. So that's all 1948. 8 years later, he's vice president. He's already served one term, but there's going to be another election. And the rumor is that President Eisenhower, in fact, this is confirmed now, at the time it was just sort of the sense of things, Eisenhower was possibly going to drop him from the ticket because it's really up to the presidential candidate who the vice presidential candidate is going to be. And Nixon pulls this very, very clever thing where he basically just goes, has a meeting with Eisenhower and tells him, by the way, I totally accept to be your candidate in the next election. And Eisenhower doesn't even really have a choice. And then he gives this press conference. That photo is from the actual press conference where he says, yes, I've assured the president I'm going to run with him for the second term. So he kind of
preempted
he interferes. He anticipates that, he could be, he sort of asserts his position like an uninvited guest, if you will, or a dinner guest who stays a little longer than they're supposed to. Very clever of him. But again, if he doesn't do this, he might not retain the reputation he has. So he does in fact become vice president for a second term. Then he runs for the presidency against John F. Kennedy and loses in 1960, and then eventually is elected president in 1968. And we're jumping way ahead now to when he's president in 1972. Two of the most famous things that the third famous thing is that he went to China in February, which is a little before this. But the other two famous things, number one, signing a major anti-missile treaty with the Soviet Union, with Leonid Brezhnev, as Venus is about to go retrograde in Cancer during a Red 3. And then the other thing, you probably already know what I'm going to say, Watergate. The actual Watergate burglary occurs during a Red 3 period, which, if you know a little bit of history, is the undoing for him and the end of his time in office, ultimately, even though he's going to stick around for 2 years. So again, we have a very unambiguous chronology. You don't need to love Nixon or hate Nixon to appreciate, his marriage, his daughter, these critical steps in his political rise, and the most critical step in his political fall all occurred during Red 3 phases.
What was the period he was running when he lost the first election?
Well, that election, see, the interesting thing about American elections, again, this is, I didn't want to emphasize one country more than others. A little bit of Russia, a little bit of France, a little bit of India. But the American elections, unlike your elections in India, unlike our elections in Canada, or a lot of parliamentary elections in the world, the American ones are timed every 4 years. Correct. They're always every 4 years, always I think it's the second Tuesday of November that they have them. And so the campaigns for the office always occur either during a blue 3 or a red 3. Some presidential campaigns are during a blue 3, which is when the sun and Venus are conjunct, but Venus is not retrograde. Some are during the red 3. In 1960, we're in a blue 3 election, and he loses to Kennedy. Kennedy was born during a blue 1, so I think the blue phase favored Kennedy a bit more. In 1968, Nixon does run during another one of the blue 3's election, but his candidate is not born as close to Venus retrograde as Nixon is. Let's put his opponent is not born nearly as close to Venus retrograde as Nixon is, and that might be indeed the deciding factor for him. All right. Okay. Now, enough with all these Westerners. Let's get on to Red 4 and something that I think your viewers will be particularly interested in. Red 4. The last time we had a Red 4 retrograde was in late 2013, early 2014. It's now in Capricorn. But if we go way back to 1870. Oh, wait. I'm sorry. There's one person I'm going to be doing before the Indian one. I forgot this one is in here. It's another Russian person, but then I'm going to get into the Indian one. I switched around the timeline at the last minute. Okay, so 1870, we're going to talk about another famous Russian quickly, and then we will get to the Indian person, Vladimir Lenin. He's born during a Red 4. Okay, so there's his Venus. He's born during a Red 4. His sister, who's a very famous revolutionary as well, is also born during a Red 4. So out of, I think there were 6 children, 6 or 7, but 2 of them are born during Red 4. That's quite remarkable in terms of the overall ratio of kids being born. One of the most important events in his life, their father dies during a Red 4. And because the father dies, the oldest brother winds up becoming a revolutionary. He helps some other students build a bomb. They're caught and he's hanged. This is the year afterwards. And this is what many people say turns Lenin into a revolutionary, his revenge over his brother. And of course, someday Lenin is going to order the execution of the royal family, which I'll get to in a second. So there is a sort of, you kill my brother, I kill you kind of thing to Lenin's life. So the father dies. That's the event that really triggers all these other things happening. And that's during a Red 4. Now, Lenin didn't marry his wife during a Red period, but he did meet her. We don't know the exact date, but we do know it's February of 1894. So no matter what, that was during a Red 4 period. This is the woman, Krupskaya, who's going to be with him right until his deathbed. Obviously, one of the most important people in his life. And they meet during a Red 4 period. But interestingly, there's another couple that's getting together during the same Red 4 period in 1894. This is when the future czar becomes engaged to the princess. They eventually, of course, with their children and some other people, are going to be executed by on Lenin's orders by Soviets, by Bolsheviks. So I just kind of find it interesting that their engagement also comes up during this Red 4 period. The eventual nemesis, if you will, of Lenin, or Lenin's their nemesis, I guess, more specifically. 8 years later, now keep in mind, in 1902, Lenin is still just this unknown revolutionary guy. He's one in thousands, or maybe tens of thousands of people who undercover are planning revolutionary acts and what have you. But he publishes this pamphlet, translated into English. The pamphlet is called "What Is to Be Done," and it's a political diatribe, sort of Bolshevik ideology, but it's the thing that really gives him a name. Again, like with a lot of the other people I've been discussing, this is what makes him famous. This is what gives him credibility. And when the revolution does happen 15 years later, the fact that he wrote this pamphlet is one of the major things that gives him
launchpad, basically.
Yeah, it gives him the credibility as a revolutionary because he wrote this very influential pamphlet. So there's that. Now, in 1910, I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Stalin that the Bolsheviks had a split with the Mensheviks. There was a split in the communists, and they came into these 2 factions. And that was in 1903 during a Red 5. And then I showed you in 1905 during a Red 1 is when the Bolsheviks had their first Congress away from the Mensheviks. Now, during this Red 4 in 1910, Lenin wants to maintain the break with the Bolsheviks. He doesn't want to unite with them. But he's overruled by the other Bolsheviks, saying, no, we're going to try and unite with the Mensheviks. And he loses the vote. And it's the most vulnerable and weak period in his revolutionary career. Luckily for him, I don't know if it was lucky for the world, but luckily for him, within a few months, this unity sort of breaks down and the parties remain separate, certainly up until the revolution and even afterwards. So it is, but it is a bit of a, it's the least amount of power that he's going to have in a long time, certainly the least amount of power he'll have with the Bolsheviks up until when he takes ultimate power. So that's also a red 4. And now finally, the last red 4 in his life, just a couple of months after the Bolsheviks have taken power, the war is going on with Germany, and the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ending Russian involvement in the war. He has to give up a lot of land, though, the Ukraine and Poland, to Germany. Of course, Germany will wind up losing it when the war ends 9 months later during a Blue II period, the armistice in 1918. But this is sort of one of the reasons Lenin has come to power, is that he has promised he'll negotiate peace with the Germans. But there's a very sort of bitter pill in terms of the amount of land, really valuable farmland, that the Bolsheviks are giving up to the Germans in order to have that peace. So that's the last one. And Lenin would not die during a red period. He'd die a few months before a red 3. But nonetheless, this is the last red 4 of his period. He was born of his life. He was born during a red 4. His sister, his father dying, these other important, meeting his wife, writing the famous pamphlet. All these really key events, again, unambiguous events, occurred in his life during red 4.
Fascinating.
All right.
Yeah.
Now back to what I was promising a few minutes ago. We're going to finally get to our Indian candidate. Okay. Now, Indira Gandhi was born during a Black 1 period, but again, she was born just 9 days before a red 4 period began.
Yeah.
So her progress chart, by the time she's 9 years old, would be in a red 4. And red 4 events, this also touches on another one of your questions earlier about whether the politician coming into these red periods also has to do with the nation, because I think there's a pretty good case here for India as a modern republic having a strong tie to the red 4. But we're mostly going to go through her life, and it's personal things with regard to her life alongside her her political career. First off, once again, marriage. She marries her husband, Feroz Gandhi. She's, of course, Indira Nehru at the time. She marries her husband during a red 4 period. Now, very interestingly, he first proposed to her, according to a biography, in October 1933, which was just before she turned 16 and about a month before a red 4 period began. But finally, they did. The marriage was postponed. War was going on and Free India movement, but they did get married in the middle of all that during a red 4 period. So again, yet another marriage, as I've shown over and over and over again. These weddings, really critical weddings, come up during the red period that seems to be central in the person's life. So right off the bat, she gets married during that period. 8 years later, what do you know? The Republic of India is declared. The Constitution comes into effect. I was in India 2 years ago on January 26th. I saw with my own eyes how Indians feel on this day. It's one of the 3 national holidays, very, very important. But for Indira personally, she's been living with Feroz, her husband, I think, not Lahore, Lucknow. They've been living in Lucknow. But right in this period, in early 1950, during the Red 4 period, she leaves Feroz and goes to live with her father in Delhi to sort of be with him on the political career, and takes the kids with her. Feroz eventually will get elected to parliament, I think the following year, and join her. The marriage isn't over yet, but she has left her husband to live in a different city to be with her father, and that's also on a personal level. But indeed, obviously, just right off the bat, the Republic of India, its inception chart, came about during a Red 4 phase.
Right.
Partition was during a Blue 5 phase, just for anyone who might be wanting to ask that question. So it was during a Blue phase, and I can touch on that in a broader history. But obviously, in terms of the Constitution, the Republic as a political entity, this is very important to India. It's, it speaks for itself. Okay, now 8 years later. Now this is interesting because I'm just going to go back a little bit before I talk about this. The Red 4 seems to be, along with everything else we're looking at, I sort of hinted at it with 1950, it tends to be a time when Indira's family members will be sort of, At loggerheads, yes, thank you. They'll be they'll be factionalizing. You know, they wind up sort of splitting into factions. Obviously, I mean, anyone who knows this much about Indian politics knows that the family continues to have these contentious divisions.
Yes.
We go back to early 1926 when Indira was a little girl. You know, that's right when her mother is diagnosed with tuberculosis, and her grandfather arranges for the family to sail to Europe so that the mother can be treated. And they have to sail on the same boat as, it's obviously it's her father, Nehru, and the mother, and Indira, but they're also with Nehru's sister, Nan Pandit, and her husband, and they're all sailing together. And Nehru's sister and Nehru's wife do not get along. And eventually, Indira herself is going to have some problems with Nan Pandit as well. Incidentally, Nan Pandit is born during a Red 3. And so is another person that Indira is going to fall out with, but I'll spare us that for now. But we're going to keep seeing these sort of the splits in the family. Excuse me, that boat ride. We don't know too much about the boat ride, but we do know that for a few weeks they're all stuck on a steamship together, and that Nehru's sister and Nehru's wife do not get, in other words, Indira's mother and Indira's aunt do not get along. And she's 9 years old. Remember, her progressed son moves into Red 4 when she's about 9, and it's just as her progressed son is doing that she's exposed as a little girl to this sort of rift. All right, now back to this slide at hand. In 1958, this is one of the first sort of big political scandals in India, and Nehru is president, but his son-in-law, Feroz, is the one who exposes this corruption scandal, forcing the finance minister to resign. And it's a schism now between Indira's husband and her father. Also a very pronounced sort of division, and this breaks out during a Red 4 period. So that's relatively unambiguous. Now, what do you think happens 8 years later? By this point, Feroz has died, but it is during a Red 4 period that Indira is elected president. As you know, her predecessor died very suddenly and very unfortunately in the middle of negotiations with Pakistan after the 1965 skirmish. But so the circumstances are a little
mischievous.
Yes, to say the least. It depends on who you ask. Some people think there's some mischief there. Perhaps there was. I'm not here to be the judge of that, but one way or the other, this is again relatively unambiguous. Like we've seen with Churchill or de Gaulle, not only are marriages and family things tied into all this, but also the real political ascent, the seizing of power also comes into the same Red period. Quite unambiguous. All right, now back to the personal. 8 years later, on 14th of December 1973, her son Sanjay was born during the Red 2 period, incidentally, in December of 1946. And he meets a young woman who was born during the Red 3 period. You remember Nan Pandit, Indira's aunt, was born during the Red 3. Well, Maneka Anand, who at this point is only 17, was also born during the Red 3 in August of 1956. They meet. They're going to get married the following September during a Blue 2. But they do meet. This is obviously important. During the Red 4, Maneka and Sanjay meet. Now, interestingly enough, I told you Nan Pandit and Maneka Gandhi are probably two of Indira Gandhi's most identifiable female adversaries. Although she and her aunt did sort of mend fences to some degree. It wasn't quite as bad as this woman, as people probably know, was never really resolved and still isn't. But the interesting so the two women who are born during Red 3 are obvious, nemesis or adversaries to Indira, but also two of the most tragic events in her life also occurred during Red 3. Her father, Nehru, died in 1964 during a Red 3, and her son, Sanjay, right here, died in a plane crash. I think he was goofing around in a plane. He died during the Red 3 in 1980. So even though I'm discussing mostly the Red 4 periods, there's also a case for Red 3 having this sort of sinister presence in Indira's timeline. But here we go. This is Sanjay meeting Maneka in late 1973 during the Red 4. And what do you think happens 8 years later? By 8 years later, Maneka is now a widow. It's one Venus Red. Her husband died during the Red 3. She was born during the Red 3. Now it's the Red 4, and she gives a speech that is sort of, you know, divisive, not a speech that Indira wants her to give. And she's been living with her son, her and Sanjay's son, in Indira's home. But on this day in 1982, during the Red 4 period, Indira basically kicks her out of the house because and this is politically, obviously, this is going to be important. As I said, I think this still has relevance today in Indian politics and history. Indira did not die during the Red phase. She died a few months after a Blue 3. So her death can't be tied to this cycle, but I think I've made a pretty good case for the Red 4 having a very pronounced relationship with her timeline. So that's an interesting bit of work. I'm thrilled to be able to share this with an Indian audience who can really appreciate the amazing pattern and the way it ties into everything. So whether one is looking at a chart of the Republic to sort of determine where it's going in political history, or, you know, again, if one wants to look at older Indian history and see how these cycles play out, I've at least offered some kind of starting point for us to begin these types of inquiries, and there's many, many more to do, and I certainly have a lot ahead of me. Now I have one more example to discuss. I think I've already mentioned, I know I've already talked about two Russian guys. I don't know why I'm not necessarily favoring Russians over Americans. I removed President Roosevelt from the slideshow. Maybe I should have balanced it out with the Americans. I don't know. But the truth is I have so much American material, so much Russian material. Invariably, I'm cutting out most of the stuff anyway and just offering you some juicy nuggets to stimulate curiosity and provoke the right questions. So this is the Red 5 period. I'm including this guy because I think, you know, I've covered Red 1, Red 2, Red 3, Red 4. And I want some Red 5 in here. And this guy's life is quite interesting with regard to Red 5. I've already mentioned who it is. It's Vladimir Putin. Now, you remember I was saying earlier, I try to come up with a theory and then I try to destroy the theory. Now here's someone else, like Indira Gandhi and like Richard Nixon. He's not born during a red phase, he's born during a black period. But unlike those other two where I can at least make an excuse for the secondary progression moving them into a red phase, he'll have to be quite old before his progressed chart moves into a red phase. Although he was born, if this time of birth is correct, it's generally accepted, but I don't think it's, I've never seen a birth certificate, so who knows, maybe it's not the right time. But if it is the right time, he was born with Venus quite close to the ascendant. I know your viewers are probably used to looking at square charts and
or
all
the
that.
diamond charts, square of the diamond charts.
Or the square of the diamond charts. But, the way a Western chart works, this Venus is very close to the ascendant, which might be the reason why we find the Red 5 transit being so prominent in his life. But here we go. Number one, his mother was born during a Red 5 period. Once again, we're going into parents and unambiguously important people in the person's life. We're going to jump way ahead to 1975. I don't have a specific date, but I do know for a fact that Putin graduated from the University of St. Petersburg in June 1975, and that he immediately enlisted in the KGB, where he would become an agent. So between June and August of 1975, when this would have taken place, this was a Red 5 transit. So it's a pretty good ballpark figure that no matter what the specific date was, he joined the KGB during a Red 5 phase. 8 years later, once again, we're getting into weddings. How many weddings have we looked at? Vladimir Putin gets married. The story is, like, he'd been dating this woman for about 2 years, but the story is that he couldn't rise in the KGB unless he was married. In the KGB, they tended to favor married men for promotion. And some people think that he got married just so he could be promoted. As I mentioned, his oldest daughter was born during a Red 1 period in 1985, and the Red 1 is very common for the children of Russian rulers, be they Soviet leaders or the czars. Red 1 is a very powerful cycle in Russian history, going back to Catherine the Great at least. But here we're looking at Vladimir Putin in Red 5, so I'm just going to show the Red 5 transits. 8 years after Vladimir was married, And remember, he joined the KGB during a Red 5. He also resigned from the KGB during a Red 5. On a personal note, I was actually in East Berlin on this day, August 19th, 1991, when the KGB attempted to overthrow Boris Yeltsin and sort of maintain the Soviet Union status quo, but this really was the beginning of the end. By the end of the year, the Soviet Union would be dissolved, but it's because of this coup, I think it's the following morning, although Putin will say right from this instant he knew what side he was on, he resigns from the KGB. So he joined the KGB and resigned from the KGB during a Red 5 period, relatively unambiguous. 8 years later, here we go again, parents dying. I've shown you a lot of these. It occurs to me, one thing I meant to include in the slideshow and forgot to is the fact that Hitler's mother was born and died during a Red 3. So, you know, again, there's that kind of thing. But here we go. Vladimir's mother was born during a Red 5 and his father died during a Red 5. His mother had died just a few months before this. So that's relatively unambiguous, another parental death. Obviously a big, big deal. What's interesting about this time, though, is Putin was literally, he had just come from his father's funeral in St. Petersburg and went back to Moscow. And right when he gets back, this is a couple of days later, or maybe this occurred in St. Petersburg, I forget. I think it happened in Moscow, and I just have the slide mislabeled for St. Petersburg. But this is when, out of the blue, he's a total unknown. The first day that you or I or most people in the world heard the name Vladimir Putin was the 9th of August, 1999, when he was named prime minister by Boris Yeltsin. This is during the Red 5. By the end of the year, he would ascend to the presidency and the total power. But this is really, none of that is going to happen if he's not named prime minister. He was the 5th prime minister that Yeltsin named in the previous year and a half because there was a lot of political instability. And you can see Putin at that point looked a little unsure of what was happening to him. Maybe he just looks very sad because his father just died a few days ago. But there we go, Red 5, political ascension, like I showed with Indira, like I showed with Nixon, like I showed with Churchill and de Gaulle. It's quite unambiguous that the cycle plays in the personal, but also in the general politics. Now, 2 more to go. In 2007, this was quite important. Putin himself went to Guatemala City and made the appeal for Russia to host the 2014 Olympic Games in Sochi. And they were not considered the favorite, but he flew there himself personally. And amazingly, not a lot of people know this, Putin can speak English. He gave this speech in English. Usually he speaks in Russian. There's no reason for him to speak in English. But he can actually speak English reasonably well. In this picture you see of him making the case for Sochi to host the Olympics, he speaks very good English. Much better than any American president ever spoke Russian, I'll tell you that. So this is during a Red 5. Interestingly, when the Olympic Games happened in 2014, that was in a Red 4 period. And as you might recall, right as those games ended, the Russians invaded the Crimea and took it from the Ukraine, which was also during a Red 4. So and I could go, well, I already showed you Lenin and the relationship of Lenin with Red 4. Russian history with Red 4s along with Red 1s, very, very vast amount of data that I could present given more time in the right context. But this was important. This is just, this was important, I think, to Russians because in 1980, the Soviet Union hosted the games, but because they had just invaded Afghanistan, a lot of people boycotted those games, a lot of countries, including the US. So this was, in a sense, a sort of a triumph because now at last Russia could properly host Olympic Games that would be uncontroversial. And of course, he'd be smart enough to wait till invade the Crimea until after the games were over. So there you go. That's an important thing. And just one more event, 8 years after this was only just 2 years ago, during the Red 5 period in 2015, you might remember this photo from news stories at the time. Putin and Obama, President Obama at the time, were at the United Nations General Assembly at the same time in New York. And Putin gave a speech that was very, very critical of U.S. foreign policy. And obviously Barack Obama's in the room. Mm-hmm. So, and you can see the look on Obama's face in this photo. He doesn't look very happy, does he? Whereas Putin looks quite, unlike that photo, I showed that photo from 1999 when he's shaking Yeltsin's hand and he looks all kind of apprehensive. At this point, he's a lot more cocksure. And so this is, again, relatively unambiguous. He's sort of vanquished a major foe in some way.
Yeah.
He didn't vanquish Obama, but he certainly humiliated him that day. And it's not something that the U.S. are used to happening. And of course, the United Nations meets in New York City, which is in the United States. So it's really doing it in his own home
territory.
Yeah. So there we go. I mean, I do have many. I do have many more examples, but I just wanted to outline a few in each of these to show what I'm doing, how I'm doing it. It does help, obviously, if your viewers have some grounding in history, but I think I've chosen people whose stories are pretty well known, and you don't have to be a serious historian to appreciate, even without knowing very much, so much of these details, that the marriages, the children being born, the political ascent, in many cases death. It remains to be seen with Putin. Obviously someday he'll die, we don't know when, but maybe it will be during a red period. But I think I've made a pretty good case for why we can follow the synodic cycles in this way and extract really meaningful details. And my feeling is, I mean, this is the way I work as a working astrologer. Obviously, I do read natal charts. I do look at all the planets, but there are many ways a working astrologer can use this method to enhance already the techniques and the knowledge that they have. For instance, later this year in 2018, between October and December, we're going to enter a red 2 phase. Now, that occurs in tropical Scorpio or late tropical Libra. For a Vedic astrologer, this would be in sidereal Libra. But either way, if we're looking at a chart and we see someone's got the ascendant or a very important planet in that area of the zodiac, we know that Venus retrograde is going to cross over that part of the chart. And here, I'll stop the share so that we're not distracted by Mr. Putin. So if we know that Venus retrograde is going to cross the ascendant or cross the moon or the sun or what have you during the course of its retrograde in the red 2 phase, we might speak to the client and say, well, what was happening for you October to December of 2010 or 2002 or 1994, any of the 1986, 1978, any of these other times that we've been in red 2 phases. And very, very often, more often than not, so long as the person has a good memory for their personal chronology, a story emerges, a really unambiguous story, something that taken from there, we can start to project into the future, even before we break out all the other horoscopic techniques that we use. And as we've seen, someone doesn't have to be born during a red phase in order for the red phases to have a pronounced effect on their life. There are other things that will determine that. But that being said, there are ways, if Venus is rising, if the ascendant or other bodies fall on the path of Venus retrogrades, if the person's timeline, if they give you a timeline of events in their life so far, and we notice that a lot of them occur during red phases, yes, we can start to project and look forward and use this method in a very practical way in our everyday practice.
So it's been really fascinating, and I'm sure that once we have got used to your style of presenting and the dates that you have shown, many of us will get back to our drawing boards and look at events in our life and events in our history. But it's really amazing that things can occur at such regularity and with such precision as such. And I would probably want to say that we keep saying that behind every successful man, there is a successful woman or a woman behind. In your case, you have shown that it's been several women, people, daughters, wives, and mothers born during that phase or dying during that phase. So it's really, really amazing. And Venus been signifying the female side quite a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
And in Vedic astrology, we also have Venus signifying the father.
Interesting.
So it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, actually, we have certain theories as to when it will signify the father, depending upon day and night births. But I can actually draw a lot of parallels from what you have said. And maybe once we get back and then iron out the finer points, there could be something similar that can be attributed in the Vedic phenomena.
I have no doubt. I really enjoy the learning more and more about the Vedic system. As you can see, I included the position of the nakshatras and all
Yes.
these chart examples, more just as a sort of guide point, even with the guide point, just like the tropical positions. I didn't get into the finer points of, of interpreting these positions, just to give your viewers an idea of where things
Absolutely.
were placed during these events. But I have no doubt that however horoscopic astrology was designed, and for all the differences between the Vedic and Western systems, there are plenty of very basic similarities, like dividing the chart into 12 and using transits. There's some very basic things that are similar, and my feeling is certainly that whoever designed these systems, whatever knowledge went into creating horoscopic astrology, probably involved the kind of knowledge that I've presented today, that I'm sort of rediscovering, an understanding of the synodic cycles and how they operate. To me, it just seems, I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but it just seems very likely that it's the kind of knowledge that would have gone into creating overall systems like this.
Precisely. And the best part of this particular system that you have just elaborated is that it really doesn't matter whether we are following the Western system or the Vedic system, because the dates don't change. It's just the signs where it happens might change a bit, but otherwise the dates virtually remain the same. So it's been really fascinating, and I'm sure that we would love to have you soon again for your Mars synodic cycle, and I'm sure that time you can equalize on your charts that you wanted to between Russia, US, and the other countries if you so desire.
Yes, there is a lot to say about those countries and Mars retrogrades. I would love to come back, Mohan, and talk about Mars retrograde sometime. You know, maybe in a few months after I've cleared my desk a little of the things that await me. But I would love to do that. Thank you for offering and inviting me. It's been a great pleasure to be able to share this material with you, and thank you to your viewers.
Thank you, and the pleasure is all ours. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic! Thank you.